She is the wealthiest heiress, but I am the poor artist who dared to whisper, "I love you." The bitter scent of burning turpentine was the only warning before she dragged me behind the heavy velvet curtains. One step from her father's private security detail outside would mean my immediate arrest. It would mean a quiet, brutal banishment from the elite world she called a prison. Yet, as the silver moonlight caught the sharp edge of her diamond necklace, she pressed her forehead against mine. Her breath was shaking in the dark. Clara sat perfectly still on the velvet chaise, watching me. The air in the private gallery was freezing. A sharp winter draft crept under the heavy doors. The only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic scratching of my charcoal. The scent of linseed oil and her expensive rose perfume filled the narrow space between us. A tiny pulse jumped in the delicate hollow of her neck. Her pale skin flushed under my intense gaze. Her large green eyes locked onto mine. I saw her pupils dilate in the dim morning light. She adjusted the strap of her sleeveless silk dress. The soft pink fabric rustled quietly in the silence of the room. I wanted to take a step forward. I wanted to close the narrow gap between us. Instead, I forced myself to lean back. I had to maintain the professional boundary. I was just a poor, struggling painter. She was the sole heiress to a multi-billion-dollar fortune. I was buying her time with my art. Every pencil mark I made on the paper was a touch I was forbidden to give her. Clara let out a soft, shaky breath. She stood up from the velvet chaise. The pink silk of her dress pooled around her feet. She took 3 slow steps toward my easel. The distance between us was completely gone. She stood so close I could feel the radiating warmth of her skin. It was a sharp contrast to the cold room. My chest felt tight with a sudden dangerous heat. She reached out. Her fingers were burning hot against my cold, trembling wrist. The sudden touch sent a jolt of electric heat straight to my chest. My breath caught in my throat. She looked up at me with a desperate, wild longing in her eyes. Her face was pale. She whispered that her life was a cold transaction. She asked me to hold her. The physical tension in the warm room was suffocating. I wanted to run away to protect us, but her touch was a heavy anchor. I took a deep breath. I stepped back to create a safe boundary between us. I told her that her father would destroy my career. But Clara did not retreat. She took another step forward. She closed the distance to only 3 inches. She reached up and placed both of her hands on my chest. I felt her rapid heartbeat under my palms. She tilted her head back. She begged me to love her anyway. We stood frozen in the quiet room. The grand clock in the hall ticked slowly. Every single minute of our secret sessions felt like borrowed time. I looked down at her lips. I knew the fall would be absolute ruin, but neither of us could step back into safety. We were helpless. The morning after our private encounter in the gallery, the world forced us back into our roles. Her father had commissioned a massive portrait of their entire family dynasty. It was a project that would secure my gallery lease for 3 years. I could not afford to say no. I stood in the grand reception hall, holding my sketch pads. The heavy oak doors of the foyer creaked open. Clara walked in, surrounded by her family's wealth. She wore a tailored white wool coat that looked pristine. Her forest green eyes met mine for a brief second. I saw her eyelids flutter slightly before she looked away. She had to sit for me for 3 hours every single afternoon. It was her father's strict command. We had to work together to complete the initial layout. It was a joint effort we could not escape. I set up my large wooden easel in the morning room. The air in the room was chilling. A biting winter draft blew through the high windows. The fireplace held only a mound of dying gray ash. Clara took her seat on the high-backed wooden chair. She looked like a perfect, untouchable statue. Our heads were only a few feet apart as I adjusted her pose. I could hear the soft, rhythmic rustling of her silk dress. The scent of her expensive rose perfume filled the narrow space between us. It was a sweet, intoxicating aroma. I reached out. My hand hovered over her shoulder. I wanted to adjust the drape of her shawl. My fingers were cold and stiff from the drafts. The closeness made my skin prickle with heat. I saw a tiny pulse jump in her neck. I forced my hand back. I picked up my charcoal stick. I began to sketch her profile with rapid strokes. I told her we had to finish the main layout by Friday. I said her father expected absolute perfection from his hired hands. Clara did not look at me. She kept her gaze fixed on the tall window. She told me she understood her duty. She said she was used to doing what her father demanded. Her voice was quiet, but it held a sharp edge of pain. The silence returned, heavy and thick. It felt like an electric wire hummed between us. My charcoal scratched against the paper, a steady beat in the quiet. I watched her left hand rest on her lap. Her fingers were trembling slightly. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to wrap my hands over her cold fingers. But the professional boundary was a heavy wall. I had to remain the silent artist. She had to remain the wealthy heiress. We had to play the part her father bought. Every stroke of my charcoal felt like a hidden promise. Every minute of the sitting felt like a beautiful, dangerous torture. We were bound together by our work, but we were separated by our worlds. We could not escape the invisible lines. The rain began to lash against the glass skylight of the small art storage room. It was nearly 7 in the evening, and the main gallery was completely dark. The wealthy patrons had all gone home. We were trapped together inside this narrow, windowless space. The metal shelves around us were cold and gray. They held stacks of stretched canvases and heavy boxes of pigment. The old water pipes in the corner clanked and groaned. They released a dry, suffocating heat into the tight room. The only light came from the dim hallway bulb slipping through the door. It cast long, dramatic shadows across the dusty floorboards. We were bent over a wooden crate, our heads only 6 inches apart. I could hear her shallow, rapid breathing in the quiet. I could smell the subtle, sweet scent of her rose perfume. The closeness made my skin prickle with a sudden, intense warmth. I slowly turned my head to look at her. The distance between our faces was less than a foot. I could see the golden flecks in her forest green eyes. Her pupils dilated as she looked at my lips. I asked her if she found safety in this darkness. Clara closed her eyes, her lower lip caught between her teeth. She told me I must not look at her that way. Her voice was a mere soft whisper. I did not pull back. I wanted to lean closer. I told her that the storm had washed the rest of the world away. I said we were the only two people who existed tonight. I begged her to let us forget the rules of her husband's world. Clara gripped the edge of the cold metal shelf. Her knuckles turned white. She was fighting her own desire. She wanted to be close to me. She told me our feelings would ruin us. She reminded me of my career. I knew she was right. I pulled my arm back slowly. I took a step back toward the door. I gave her space. The push and pull kept us frozen in our own silence. The rain continued to fall heavily against the glass. We stood in the shadows, waiting for the storm to break. We were helpless. The silence was a thick physical weight between our bodies. I could feel the intense heat radiating off her skin. My hand hovered over the cold wood of the crate. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to hold her, but my mind screamed at me to run. We were living on borrowed time in this gallery. Every second felt like a beautiful, dangerous promise. I slowly lowered my hand. Clara took a soft breath. She did not follow me into the shadow. We stood there in the dark. The cold draft from the floorboards chilled my boots. The heat of her presence kept me warm. We could not turn away from the flame. Our breathing was the only rhythm in the dark. The following evening, we were forced to wear our masks in public. Her father was hosting an elegant winter banquet in the grand dining room. I was hired to capture the event in quick charcoal sketches for the guests. Classical music played softly in the background, a light melody of violins. The room was bright, lit by towering crystal chandeliers that gleamed. The sound of laughter and the soft chinking of crystal filled the air. I stood near the corner of the room, holding my heavy wooden sketch pad. My hands were dry. My shoulders ached from a long day of work. I tried to focus on my sketches, but my eyes kept tracking Clara. She sat at the head of the table. She looked like a perfect high society queen in her sleeveless green gown. Her rich chestnut hair was pinned up in an elegant chignon. She spoke politely to her father's wealthy business associates. Her outward composure was flawless. But as I watched, her father introduced a young steel heir to her. I saw a sharp jaw twitch in her porcelain face. Her forest green eyes darted across the crowded room until they locked onto mine. A sudden wave of heat rose in my chest. The contrast between her cold world of transactions and our secret storage room was terrifying. Clara excused herself from the table. She walked slowly toward the gallery corridor, her green silk dress rustling quietly. I waited 30 seconds, my heart hammering against my ribs, before I followed her. I found her standing near a tall display case of silver plates. The surface of the silver looked chilled. She pressed her fingers flat against the cold metal, trying to compose herself. I stood 2 feet away, keeping the professional distance. I pretended to study a sculpture on the pedestal. I told her she should return to the guests. I said her father was watching her every move. Clara did not look at me. Her head was bowed. She whispered that she could not bear the polite lies anymore. She said her father had finalized her betrothal. A sudden, sharp ache filled my chest. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to wrap my arms around her waist. I saw her pupils dilate as she turned her head. I forced my hands to stay at my sides. I told her we had to maintain the boundary. I said her family would destroy us if we were caught. Clara flinched as if she had been struck. She pulled her hands back from the silver. Her fingers were trembling. She told me she was tired of playing the perfect asset. I took a slow step back, giving her space. The invisible walls of her father's empire were between us again. We had to wear our armor. We had to pretend we were strangers in the light. We could not let the facade break. We had to survive. I turned and walked away into the shadows of the banquet hall. The cold, winter wind howled outside the tall studio windows. Inside, the stone fireplace held only a mound of dying gray ash. I sat in my usual wooden chair, shivering slightly in my damp coat. My fingers were stiff and numb from the freezing drafts. Clara noticed my discomfort. Her expression softened into something raw. The elegant, untouchable patron's wife was suddenly gone. She walked over to the small table in the corner. She filled her electric kettle with cold water. The high sound of the boiling water filled the quiet room. She poured the steaming water into a white ceramic mug. She added a spoonful of sweet honey. The silver spoon clinked softly against the ceramic. She walked back to me and held the warm mug out. I reached up to take it from her, but I did not grab the handle. Instead, I wrapped both of my hands over her fingers. I encased her cold hands in mine. The sudden touch was electric. A sudden, blinding jolt ran through my veins. Clara gasped softly, her green eyes widening. A subtle, tired twitch appeared on the corner of her left eye. She did not pull her hands away. She stood frozen before me. I stood up slowly, using my height to stand over her. I told her that her hands were cold too. She whispered a desperate warning about her father. She spoke of the scandal that would destroy us. I told her the heavy door was locked. I said we could not keep pretending. She looked down at our joined hands. The warmth of her skin was the only comfort in the cold studio. Clara let out a long, shuddering sigh. She admitted that she was tired of being a perfect trophy. She told me she had spent her life trying to please her family. She said she felt completely hollow inside. The non-romantic truth hung in the air. It was a confession of her own deep, silent exhaustion. I felt a sudden, deep ache in my chest. I wanted to hold her. I wanted to protect her from this coldness. But I knew the boundary was still there. I let go of her hands. I took a slow step back. I sat down in my wooden chair. She pulled her hands to her chest. She looked away, stepping back toward the window. We were closer than we had ever been. She whispered that she had never wanted the shipping empire. She said she only wanted to be real. Her vulnerability cracked my own mask. I told her about my father. I spoke of the debts that kept me painting. I confessed that my art was my only escape from the cold streets. She turned back to me. A soft smile touched her lips. She said she envied my freedom. She said my heart belonged to you. The silence returned, but it was warm now. We had shared our secrets. We were no longer strangers. The following afternoon, the tension in the studio boiled over. I was trying to paint Clara's final pose, but she refused to remain still. She kept turning her head, staring out at the gray, rain-swept sky. Her posture was rigid, her jaw clenched. I set my wooden palette down on the small table with a loud thud. The heavy wooden frame of an empty canvas slid off my easel, hitting the floorboards. The sudden sound made her flinch. I told her she was ruining the composition. I said she had to cooperate if we were to finish the portrait by her father's deadline. Clara stood up from the chaise. Her green silk dress rustled as she walked directly toward me. Her face was flushed with anger, her green eyes blazing. I saw her nostrils flare as she took a sharp breath. The temperature in the room was chilling, but her proximity sent a sudden wave of heat through my body. She stood only 3 inches away, looking up at me. She asked me if I only saw her as a collection of lines on a canvas. She demanded to know if I cared about the person behind the paint. I stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I told her I was hired to paint her, not to psychoanalyze her. I said her father paid my bills and I had to produce what he demanded. My words were harsh, but they were a lie. I was trying to rebuild the wall. I was trying to protect myself from the consuming intensity of her gaze. Clara let out a bitter, raw laugh. She told me she was a coward. She said she was hiding behind her art because she was too afraid of what was real. We stood frozen in the narrow space. The distance between us was less than an inch. I could feel the radiating warmth of her body, a perfect contrast to the freezing morning air. The air was thick with our shallow, rapid breaths. She was so close I could see the golden flecks in her eyes. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to grab her shoulders and shake her. I wanted to pull her flush against my chest. Instead, I clenched my fists. I told her that she was the one who was afraid. I said she was going to marry a man she despised because she was too weak to stand up to her father. Clara's lower lip trembled. She flinched as if she had been struck. She took a step back, her hands clenching at her sides. The clash of our words only heightened the attraction vibrating between us. We were 2 storms colliding. The silence that followed was heavy and exquisitely alive. She turned her back to me, hiding her face. I could hear the rain lashing against the glass skylight above. The heavy air in the studio was thick with things left unsaid. I took a slow breath. The following week, the silence between us remained thick and heavy. Clara had returned to her pose, but the anger from our clash had turned into a quiet, agonizing tension. I was trying to adjust the lighting in the studio. I walked over to the tall glass partition behind her chaise. The glass was foggy from the cold winter damp. I picked up a soft cleaning rag. The soft squeak of the rag against the glass was a steady beat in the quiet. I wiped the glass, trying to clear my view of her reflection. Suddenly, Clara stood up. She walked over to the glass partition, standing directly opposite me on the other side. The distance between us was less than 3 inches. I stopped my hand. I looked at her reflection in the clear glass. Her rich chestnut hair was slightly loose. A few soft tendrils framed her pale cheekbones. Her forest green eyes were locked on my face. She raised her hand. She pressed her flat palm against the cold glass, right over my reflection. The glass was ice cold. I raised my hand. I pressed my palm against the opposite side of the pane. Our fingers aligned perfectly through the cold glass. The physical touch was blocked by the barrier, but the heat of our gazes was a physical force. My breathing became rapid and shallow. I saw her pupils dilate. I saw a small twitch in her upper lip. She was so close I could see the warm steam of her breath. It left a soft, foggy ring on the cold glass. The anticipation was an agonizing, sweet torture. I wanted to break the glass. I wanted to feel her skin. Clara stepped slowly around the partition. She stood right beside me. The barrier was gone. My hand hovered just a fraction of an inch from her bare shoulder. The burning, radiating heat of my palm was a physical force. I wanted to touch her so badly my chest ached. She did not move away. She held her breath. I slowly lowered my hand. My fingers brushed against the delicate, bare skin of her collarbone. The touch was accidental, but neither of us pulled away. My rough, charcoal-stained fingers lingered on her soft skin. The contact lasted for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, an eternity. Clara let out a soft, shaky gasp. A sudden, blinding shock ran through my veins. Her head tilted back slightly. Her eyes fluttered closed. The physical touch was electric, a sudden spark in the dry frost of the room. My fingers traced the delicate bone before I forced my hand back. I took a slow step back, giving her space. We were both shaken, our breathing rapid in the quiet. She turned and walked back to the velvet chaise without another word. The heavy silence in the room returned. We had touched, and the memory of her soft skin was burned into my fingers. I stood frozen. The storm reached its absolute peak by late evening. The wind howled against the studio glass, a wild, deafening roar. Inside the small room, the heat was intense. The small wood stove crackled, releasing a cozy, dry warmth. I stood near the tall window, staring out at the gray, rain-shrouded gardens. Clara walked toward me, her steps slow and silent on the floorboards. She had wrapped my heavy wool coat over her shoulders. The dark charcoal fabric looked massive on her slender frame. She stopped right beside me. I turned to face her. The distance between our bodies was less than 3 inches. I could feel the radiating warmth of her chest, a sweet contrast to the freezing draft near the window pane. I looked down at her face. Her forest green eyes were wide, the golden flecks bright in the firelight. Her pupils dilated as she looked at my mouth. My heart was beating a rapid, frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached out. My hand gently cupped her warm cheek. My rough, calloused fingers were incredibly dark against her pale porcelain skin. Clara let out a soft, trembling sigh. Her eyelids fluttered closed as she leaned her head into my palm. The physical connection was electric, a sudden, blinding jolt that sent a tremor through my entire body. I slowly leaned down, my head tilting. The distance between our lips was less than an inch. I could feel the warm steam of her breath on my mouth. The anticipation was an agonizing, sweet torture. I wanted to lose myself in her. Our lips were a mere millimeter apart. I held my breath, my mind completely empty of everything but her. The entire world, her father, her wealth, and my poverty had vanished. There was only this tiny, quiet vacuum of space between us. I was right on the verge of kissing her. Suddenly, a sharp, aggressive vibration shattered the silence. Her cell phone on the wooden table began to slide across the surface with a loud, buzzing hum. The screen flashed with her father's name. The harsh, bright light of the caller ID was a cold intrusion. Clara flinched as if she had been struck. She pulled her face back from my hand, her eyes wide with sudden panic. The spell was instantly broken. She took 3 rapid steps back toward the fireplace. The physical distance had returned, cold and unyielding. She picked up the vibrating phone with shaking fingers. I turned back to the window, my jaw clenched tightly. My chest felt tight with an unbearable ache. We had been so close, yet the outside world was always there to pull us back. We were still running on borrowed time. She spoke in a quiet, trembling voice to the caller, her back turned to me. I took my hand back, feeling the sudden chill of her absence. We were prisoners of our secrets, once again, trapped in the light. The morning after our near kiss, the professional walls were rebuilt with concrete and steel. Clara came to the studio late, her face completely pale. She did not look at me as she entered. She took her seat on the chaise with a cold, rigid posture. The air in the room was chilling. A steady rain pattered against the glass skylight. I sat at my wooden table, my hands trembling as I organized my paints. I forced myself to remain distant. I had to protect my heart from the devastation of our proximity. I picked up my paintbrush. I kept my eyes on the canvas, refusing to meet her gaze. I told her we had to finish the final details of her dress today. I said her father had requested a progress report by 5 o'clock. My voice was cool, clinical, and completely professional. It was a mask I wore to hide my breaking heart. Clara did not answer immediately. She kept her head turned toward the window. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, tired rhythm. I saw a tight lip twitch in her porcelain face. She whispered that she had agreed to her father's timeline. She said her engagement party was scheduled for next month. A sudden, sharp chill swept through my chest, colder than the winter draft. The silence that followed was a thick, physical weight. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drop my brushes and grab her hand. I wanted to tell her we could run away. But the absolute reality of my poverty was an unyielding wall. I could not offer her a life. I could only offer her this stolen shadow. I took a slow, deep breath to steady my hands. I told her that she was doing what was expected of her. I said her father's choice was the only path to safety. The lie felt like a physical blow in my throat. Clara flinched as if she had been struck. She pulled her hands to her chest, her fingers clenching the emerald silk. Her green eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, devastating mix of pain and understanding. She told me she was glad I understood the rules. The retreat was complete. We had stepped back on opposite sides of the uncrossable ocean. The warm closeness of the previous night had vanished, replaced by a cold, formal distance. I worked in silence for 3 hours, my eyes tracing her profile. Every stroke of my brush felt like a final goodbye. We were 2 ghosts haunting the ruins of our own desires. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway was a steady countdown to our final parting. Every minute felt like borrowed time, a beautiful torture. We could not turn away. She eventually rose and left the studio, leaving me alone in the dark shadows of my easel. The smell of her rose perfume lingered on my hands, a sweet, painful ghost. I clenched my fists. The direct threat to our fragile connection arrived 2 days later. Her father had invited the young steel heir to the estate for a private viewing of the portrait's progress. I was forced to stand by my easel in the main gallery, presenting the work. Elegant footsteps clicked on the polished floorboards. Clara walked in, arm in arm with the young man. He was tall, dressed in a pristine charcoal suit, and carried himself with absolute confidence. I saw him reach out. His hand gently touched the small of her back. A sudden, sharp wave of burning jealousy flooded my chest, hotter than any fire. My hands tightened on my charcoal stick until the wood snapped with a sharp crack in the quiet. I had to maintain my composure. I had to remain the silent, invisible artist. The steel heir looked at the canvas. He commented on the brushwork with a clinical, arrogant tone. He raised a crystal glass of champagne. The silver tray held by the butler clinked softly as he set the glass down. He turned to Clara. He smiled, telling her she would look magnificent in his family's manor. He spoke of the grand gallery he would build for her. Clara's face was pale. She smiled politely, but her eyes were empty. She did not look at him. Her forest green eyes darted across the room, locking onto mine. I saw her pupils dilate. The silent plea in her gaze was a physical blow to my heart. She reached for her glass of champagne, her fingers trembling. The steel heir noticed her shaking hands. He reached over, wrapping his fingers over her hand to steady it. The physical touch was a direct violation of our secret sanctuary. I felt my chest tighten with a suffocating, wild rage. I wanted to step forward. I wanted to knock the glass from his hand. I wanted to tell him she belonged to me. But I remained frozen. The harsh reality of our class division was an unyielding, freezing wall. I was just the hired painter. He was the wealthy suitor who could buy her world. Clara slowly pulled her hand back from his grip, taking a step away. The tension between us was an electric, agonizing weight. The steel heir smiled, completely unaware of the storm raging between us. I realized my true feelings with absolute clarity. I loved her. I could not let her marry him. I had to fight. I turned back to the canvas, my brush sweeping across the paper with desperate, aggressive strokes. The visual of his hand on hers played in my mind like a recurring nightmare. I knew I had to tell her. I could no longer live in the quiet. I had to break the rules. The storm had returned. I took a slow breath. I watched them leave the gallery, Clara's green silk gown sweeping behind her like a trail of broken promises. The silence in the empty gallery was deafening. The midnight hour brought no relief to the storm raging inside my chest. I sat alone in my dark studio, the only illumination coming from a single flickering candle. The cold winter wind howled outside, shaking the glass panes of the tall window. The fireplace held only a mound of cold gray ash. I sat in my wooden chair, my hands wrapped around my coffee mug. The ceramic was stone cold. My fingers were numb, but my mind was on fire. I kept staring at the unfinished portrait of Clara. In the grand mansion across the gardens, Clara stood alone in her vast bedroom. The fire in her hearth crackled softly, releasing a cozy, dry warmth. She wore a simple white silk robe, her chestnut hair falling over her shoulders. She stood by the tall window, looking across the dark lawn toward the faint glow of my studio. Her hands were pressed flat against the glass, her fingers trembling. Her eyelids fluttered as she closed her eyes, remembering the feel of my rough fingers on her neck. The silence in her room was a thick, suffocating weight. She looked down at the expensive diamond engagement ring resting on her vanity. The diamonds caught the firelight, flashing with a cold brilliance. She felt completely hollow inside. The shipping empire, her family's wealth, and the planned wedding felt like a golden cage. She wanted to throw the ring into the fire. She wanted to run across the dark grass and throw her arms around my neck. Back in my studio, I picked up a piece of charcoal. My hands were shaking, my jaw clenched tightly. I began to sketch her face on a blank sheet of parchment. I did not need the light. I knew every line of her face by heart. I knew the golden flecks in her green eyes. I knew the soft curve of her lips. My chest felt tight with an unbearable ache. The absolute reality of my poverty was a freezing wall, but the longing in my heart was a consuming fire. We were two souls trapped on opposite sides of the uncrossable ocean, staring at the same dark sky. The unsaid words between us were a physical weight, crushing our chests. I knew I could not let her marry the steel heir. I knew she loved me. The ticking of the clock was a countdown to our final ruin, but the quiet was no longer safety. It was a suffocating cage. I stood up, dropping the charcoal. I had to go to her. I grabbed my coat. I stepped out of the studio into the freezing winter rain, the cold drops hitting my face. I did not care about the guards. I did not care about the consequences. I had to hear her voice. I had to see her green eyes. The night was young. The road was dark. I took a slow breath. She rested peacefully against my chest, her breathing slow and steady. We were finally safe from her family. I pushed open the heavy wooden door of her gallery room without knocking. I was soaked from the freezing winter rain, water dripping from my dark curls. Clara stood by the fireplace. The sudden thud of the door made her flinch, her green eyes dilating with a mixture of terror and wild longing. I closed the door firmly behind me. I took 3 rapid, desperate strides toward her, reducing the distance between our bodies to nothing. My hands were freezing, my chest heaving with heavy breaths. She looked up at me, her face pale. I saw her pupils contract in the dim, warm light of the fire. I grabbed her wrist with an intense, unyielding grip. Her hot palm sent a sudden, electric shock straight to my heart. I told her I could not bear the silence anymore. I said I could not stand by and watch her marry a man she despised. Clara's lower lip trembled. She tried to pull her hand away, but my grip was firm and steady. I told her the wealth and the mansion were nothing to me. I love you, Clara. The confession finally broke through my lips, a raw, gravelly rasp that could never be taken back. The emotional dam had shattered completely. The truth was out in the open. Clara let out a soft, ragged sob. Tears finally spilled over her long, dark lashes, hot against her cold porcelain cheeks. She wrapped her arms tightly around my neck. Her hot breath was a sweet contrast to the chilly draft of the room. She whispered that she loved me too. She said she had loved me since the first day she walked into my gallery. She confessed that she had spent her life trying to build her family's reputation, but she had been completely hollow inside. She whispered that she was completely unraveling. She said she would rather starve with me than live in an empty golden cage without me. The vulnerability in her low voice broke the final wall between us. I pulled her flush against my chest, wrapping my arms securely around her waist. Our bodies were pressed tightly together, our heartbeats merging in the quiet. I buried my face in her chestnut hair, smelling the sweet rose perfume. The risk of absolute ruin was hanging over us, but in her arms the fear did not matter anymore. We were two broken people finding our home in the dark. The clock continued to tick, but we were no longer listening. We had crossed the final line, stepping out of our roles and into the truth. We held each other as the freezing winter rain lashed against the glass, but the warmth of our bodies was the only sanctuary we needed. I pressed my lips to her forehead, sealing the quiet promise we had made in the dark. We were officially unbound. There was no turning back. The night was ours. The storm was over. The immediate relief of our confession was a sweet, intense wave that washed away our fears. We stood in the center of the quiet gallery room, wrapped in each other's arms. The rain continued to fall softly outside, but inside our small sanctuary, the warmth was absolute. Her father's empty grand reception hall sat in the distance, but his rules did not matter anymore. We had broken the boundaries of his empire. Clara sat on the edge of my heavy wooden table, her green silk dress pooling around her knees. I stood between her knees, my arm wrapped securely around her waist. The physical heat between us was a blooming, radiant fire. I reached out, my hand gently cupping her warm porcelain cheek. Her skin was incredibly soft against my rough, calloused fingers. She leaned her head into my palm, her eyelids fluttering closed. I felt a sweet, intense relief wash over my body. We had crossed the line, and there was no going back to the roles we had played. She told me she was ready to leave. She whispered that we would go somewhere quiet. Her low, gravelly voice was a beautiful promise that made my heart leap with hope. She said we would leave the city behind and build a simple life where no one knew her family's name. I looked into her forest green eyes, seeing her absolute, pure trust in me. The fear of our uncertain future dissolved completely. I told her I would follow her anywhere. I said I would protect her from the coldness of the world. We were poor in plans, but rich in devotion. We were ready to face the consequences of our escape. Clara pulled me down beside her on the table, wrapping her arms tightly around my neck. I buried my face in her chestnut hair, smelling the sweet scent of roses. We shared the warmth in our small sanctuary, ignoring the dark clouds outside the tall window. The massive mansion in the distance looked powerless now. We had escaped the golden cage. We were no longer living on borrowed time. Every single second of this night was ours to keep. I rested my head against hers, listening to the steady, powerful thumping of her heart. We had found our home in each other. The gold band on her left hand caught the dim firelight. She slowly slid the heavy ring off her finger. She let it drop onto the wooden table with a quiet, metallic clink. It was a silent, powerful declaration. She was no longer bound. She was mine. We held each other tightly as the candle slowly burned down to a pool of cold wax. The rain outside turned to a soft, steady patter, washing away our old lives. We had broken the boundaries to find our own peace in the dark. We were officially unbound. There was no more push and pull. We were ready to run. The night was complete. We were free. The rusty carriage wheels rattled violently against the wet gravel of the country road. It was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. Behind us, the golden lights of the Montgomery estate had finally vanished into the thick winter fog. I was no longer wearing the rough sweater of a poor painter. I wore a simple wool coat that smelled of wood smoke. Clara sat beside me, no longer the wealthy heiress in her emerald silk dress. She wore a simple wool dress that we had bought from a small town shop. The fabric was soft and warm against her skin. The air inside the carriage was cold, but we did not feel the chill. We were sitting close together on the worn leather seat. The only sound in the dark cabin was the steady, rhythmic breathing of our horses. The soft patter of rain against the wooden roof was a comforting, steady hum. I sat beside her, my arm wrapped securely around her waist. I pulled her flush against my side, tucking my heavy, dark wool coat around her shoulders. She rested her head on my chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrumming of my heart. She took a slow, deep breath, inhaling my familiar scent of pine and fresh rain. I reached down and gently took her hand. Her fingers were burning hot. I wrapped them tightly around mine, squeezing her knuckles with an intense, unyielding grip. I saw a tiny pulse jump in her tight jawline. Her amber-green eyes were bright with a peaceful, quiet resolve. I looked out the small window. The gray woods slid past us like ghosts in the night. We had left everything behind. We had abandoned her family's vast wealth, the steel merchant's daughter, and the golden cage of her future. We had only her small canvas bag and my savings. We were poor now. We had no plan and no destination. But as I looked at her face, the fear of our uncertain future completely dissolved. I felt a sweet, intense relief wash over my body. I reached down and gently kissed her forehead. I whispered that we were finally free. I said we would never have to hide our love in the shadows of her family's mansion again. I said we would build a simple life where no one knew our names. I looked at her hand in mine, my fingers gently tracing the rough knuckles of her skin. I said I would work with my own hands to protect her. The sheer sincerity in her eyes brought fresh tears to mine. We had nothing but each other. But as the carriage rolled into the dark winter night, I knew we had found our true home. We held each other as the carriage rolled over the quiet hills, moving toward our secret sanctuary. The road was long. The rain was soft. I took a slow breath. I kissed her neck. She rested peacefully against my chest, her breathing slow and steady. We were finally safe from her family. 6 months had passed since the night we fled from her father's massive estate. We lived in a tiny, quiet wooden cabin near the high mountains. The setting was simple. Outside, a soft spring rain pattered against the tin roof, creating a peaceful, steady rhythm. Inside, the rustic iron stove crackled softly, filling the single room with a cozy, dry warmth. I sat on a worn wooden chair by the window, watching the green leaves of the oak trees sway in the gentle breeze. I had found work as a local carpenter. The work was hard, and my hands were rougher than before. But the modest wages I earned belonged entirely to us. Her father had tried to find us for the first few weeks, but his search had finally ceased. They had given up their pursuit. Clara was free. Clara walked into the warm cabin, her rich chestnut hair slightly damp from the soft rain. She smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her deep forest green eyes. Her eyes crinkled at the corners as she looked at me with pure, absolute devotion. She sat down on my lap, reducing the distance between us to nothing. She pulled a simple wool blanket over our shoulders, sharing her warmth. She reached out. Her hand gently cupped my cheek. Her fingers were warm and soft against my rough skin. I looked into her green eyes. There was no fear, no guilt, and no secrets left between us. I leaned in, my lips meeting hers in a deep, sweet, and incredibly slow kiss. It was a kiss of absolute peace. It was the final, perfect destination of the long, dark road we had traveled. I closed my eyes, feeling her strong arms wrap securely around my waist. The memory of the past slid away into the soft spring rain. The warm wind rustled a few forgotten sketch papers on the floorboards. The soft sound was a peaceful rhythm. I looked at her, my heart filled with a quiet, endless gratitude. Our love had survived the storm. Thank you for listening to our slow burn story of forbidden love. If you felt the intense tension of our journey, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with your favorite moment from our stolen nights. Your support keeps these stories alive. If you loved this, you will adore our next video. It is about a young chauffeur who falls for his wealthy billionaire boss's daughter. It is another beautiful, heart-wrenching story of forbidden desire and high stakes. Until next time, remember that some boundaries are meant to be broken. Let the rain wash the world away. Find your own sanctuary in the dark. Keep listening to our quiet hearts and stay safe in the storm. Goodbye. She is the wealthiest heiress, but I am the poor artist who dared to whisper, "I love you."